So let's break down the biggest misconception about 3D. Most people think that 3D is just a pop-up that you see, but there are a lot of things going on behind the scene. There is this hidden data exchange that happens between the three-party merchant, network, and the issuer. And today in this video, we are going to break it down in the most easiest way you can, since 3D is actually quite a complex protocol. So yeah, let's before we talk about the three domains, we need to separate three layers that often get mixed together. The first layer is 3D authentication. This layer is asking whether the cardholder account or transaction can be authenticated for this checkout attempt. The second layer is payment authorization. This is a different question. Authorization is where the issuer decide whether the payment itself should be approved or declined. That's the question of authorization. So the 3D acts on the authentication. The third layer is fraud and risk decisioning. Risk logic can influence authentication and it can also influence authorization, but it is not the same as either one. This is why the answer matters. 3D authentication can support authorization. It can provide authentication evidence, improve issuer confidence, and affect liability handling, but it does not replace authorization. So the authorization and the authentication, they are actually separate thing, and 3D works on the authentication part, not authorization. This thing is very important to understand, because if you mix up this authentication and authorization, you will mix up 3D. So just remember for now that 3D works on the authentication layer. So something that happens before the actual payment. So yeah, so we can also, the key takeaway is that 3D success does not guarantee payment approval, right? It makes sense because we just said that 3D happens at the authentication layer, and the approval or decline actually happening the outcome as a authorization layer, not authentication. So just remember this. Let's break down the three domain model. Now we can look at the three domain model. On the left is the acquirer domain. This is the merchant side of the flow. Merchant. It includes the merchant or the 3DS requester and the 3DS server. In many real integration, the merchant does not operate the 3DS server directly. A gateway or PSP handle it. Your gateway like Stripe, Braintree, so they actually handle it on behalf of the merchant. In the middle is the interoperability domain or the routing domain. This is where the directory server sits. The directory server is usually tied to the card scheme or network layer, and its job is to routing and interoperability. On the right is the issuer domain. This is why the issuer ACS live. The ACS means access control server. The ACS is the highest. The ACS is the issuer side component that evaluates the authentication request and returns an authentication result. So if we look into it, we'll see this acquired domain. This actually sit in the merchant side, the whole thing, and the directory server is basically the routing layer. The goal is to route the AReq or authentication request from the merchant, and then take this and forward it to the issuer ACS. So the main thing in 3D the directory server is doing is just routing it. So it just take the AReq or authentication request and then forward it to the ACS, and then the ACS will evaluate the request, and it will give ARES or authorization result back to the DS directory server, and then the directory server will send that or forward that response to the 3D server or gateway, and eventually the merchant will get this. This is how a loop will end. And after that, the merchant will continue the payment flow. So after the 3D is done, it will continue the payment. So now the authorization will basically happen. So again, I have said that 3D returns authentication outcome. So you get the response that ARES. So you can think of that authentication outcome, but not payment approval. So the payment approval will, or the payment decline, whatever outcome will be, the result will be start from this point. So that is it. Now moving on. Now let's zoom into the acquired domain. All right. So the acquired domain is basically the merchant site. So that we can easily see that there is this checkout or merchant app, and so what a merchant will do is that when a shopper enters his cart details or initiated a purchase or checkout, so after he is entering his details or let's say card number and other stuff, the 3D requester asks for the authentication. So what is this 3D requester here? So in browser, the gateway, the payment gateway or PSP, payment gateway, payment service provider, or the gateway, they actually handle the 3D SDK for the merchant. So the merchant doesn't have to set it up. So the gateway itself work, set up the 3D server and work as the or act as the SDK. So the 3D requester basically asks for the authentication, and it asks for the authentication to the 3DS server. So as you already know that 3DS server packages protocol data, the gateway is doing this job for you, and then it builds an authentication request. So this 3DS server on behalf of the merchant is forming a AReq authentication request, and then this authentication request will be sent to the DS, right? So the DS is another part, which is another party. So I didn't show that here. So this is the first party, the merchant side party, the acquirer. Also, the important stuff that I actually missed here is that so what this request will contain, right? You're sending a request. So the request will contain this risk data. What is this risk data? It could be a lot of things. What this data is, we will discuss is later further in detail. But for now, just remember this data is basically your browser data or the device data, device fingerprint. It could be the order data that you're going to ordering. It could be the browser specific data like browser window size and fingerprint or other stuff, or the device data, and account context. So this kind of metadata are actually going into that request. So we'll learn about this more in detail very soon. So it's time to talk about the 3D directory server, and as you can see, this directory server sit in the middle. So this one is actually coming from our previous domain, the merchant side domain, or the acquirer or the merchant side, and the acquirer 3D server is actually sending the AReq or authentication request and to the directory server, and directory server is just taking that and forwarding that to the issuing bank ACS. So but to do that, it has to find the correct issuer, right? Issuer ACS. So its job is to find the issuer ACS and map it and just forward it to that path. So it's just routing that AReq data or the request data to the correct ACS. So it's act like a switchboard. So it just So you can think of like a switchboard, like I have written that merchant side to issuer side. So it's like a mapping. So you just get the AReq data from the query server and directory server will just route that data and find to the correct issuer or the issuer ACS, issuer access control server. So that's the goal of directory server. So main goal is just basically routing the AReq to the ACS. All right, it's time for our third domain, not the issuer domain zone. So here comes the ACS or access control server. Before explaining this, you just need to understand the basic step here is that what is actually ACS. So ACS basically the decision maker. That's its job. So in the previous diagram, it was all about the directory server or DS. So it receives the merchant browser device and transaction context, which is routed from the DS to the ACS. So the ACS have received the AReq, and AReq contains the merchant information, the browser, then device telemetry, and transaction context. A lot of metadata of that device, master device, and also order. And this context arrive to the ACS, and ACS will evaluate this data. So this telemetry data will be evaluated by the ACS. So this data will be evaluated and it will take the decision what to do with this data. And authentication decision. So authentication decision will be made by the ACS. So what kind of authentication it can produce? So it can produce Y meaning the authenticated or authentication was successful, and then it can throw a challenge response like challenge required, or it can say failed or rejected. And also there is another it can be unavailable or it can be attempted. So what are this stuff we'll break down or discuss further later. The main goal of to show that ACS main job is to take the decision based on the AReq or authentication request received. It will basically give you a response, and this response will contain this data and also some other data, but this is the main thing. So this response is called ARES or authentication response. So you just receive the AReq from the DS, and the authentication decision will be made by the ACS here, and then it will be called the ARES or authentication response. So now it's time to talk about the AReq and ARES loop. So you already know the AReq is basically the authentication request, and ARES is the authentication response. So the ACS will, in the previous we have seen that ACS basically return the ARES, and the AReq actually forwarded from the 3DS server or the merchant to the directory server. So let's just understand more. See that here. Let's just look at here. So let me zoom in. So the merchant or 3D server. So it basically do a post request with the authentication request. So it has a payload and it has some data. What kind of data you already know? So it contains browser telemetry, so some transaction data and it forwarded to the directory server. So this payload is basically JSON data that contains this rich browser telemetry, and it's routed to the directory server. And directory server has only one job, is just to route. So it sit here and it just forward the data to the issuer ACS. So the directory basically route the AReq authentication request to the correct issuer ACS. So it also find the correct issuer ACS. Its job is not just to route but also find the correct issuer ACS, and it point to it and just direct that data to the ACS, and ACS job is to evaluate that request. And request, already it has some content, that metadata, browser, transaction data, and then based on the data, mostly the telemetry data, browser fingerprints, and some order data, that issuer will take the decision that if that data coming from a legitimate customer, if that's a legitimate customer or not, the response will contain that, of course. So after evaluating the request, it sends a ARES, or the authentication result or response. So the AR is basically authentication result or authentication response. The ARES contain the result or the status. So the directory server then forward this to the merchant or merchant 3DS server, and merchant can see that. So this is how the loop works. So only got us the authentication outcome only, not payment approval, or still no authorization of the payment actually happens. So the whole thing is a authentication part. This is not a authorization part. So this is why the authorization is still yet not begun yet. So this is the authentication part, and with this part, with this 3D response, the authentication outcome of the ARES response, the authentication part will be end, and after that the authorization part, the actual transaction fail or success thing will happen. So this is very important to understand. So the Inter 3D is actually acting on the pre-authorization or authentication part. All right. So this is a summary of the entire video. So the merchant sends an authentication request through the 3DS server. So the merchant of 3DS server actually sending the AReq or authentication request to to the directory server or DS. So this directory server actually run by the networks like Visa, MasterCard, or Amex, and this directory server is like a routing layer. It just route the AReq to the issuer ACS or issuer access control server, and issuer accept that and do the risk based authentication. So it just verify or analyze those telemetry data or the browser data that is available in the AReq request and generate a response, and then the response will be sent back to the directory and directory will forward to the merchant. So that's the easy way to saying that. And so there is a payment authorization that actually happens after the this pre-authorization or the authentication. So it's a separate part. So that's why I've said that 3DS authentication not guarantee payment approval. So you can actually succeed with 3D and yet your transaction can fail because this is a different phase. So this outcome of course will be helpful to determine the outcome of the payment, but also it can influence the payment outcome, but it doesn't mean that your payment is successful. It doesn't determine that. So for that you have to actually understand the payment authorization part that happens later of the authentication. So 3D is actually acting in the pre-authorization or authentication layer, and the payment authorization or success, approval, or decline happening at the authorization layer, that's a separate layer. So we'll discuss about this later, and the goal of the video is to give you a basic idea of the 3D and breaking down its parts and how it works the party. You learn about the 3 domain, and that's it. If you like this video and find this helpful, let me know, and you can connect with me on the LinkedIn. So thanks for watching.